Hear ye, hear ye. As thy royal messenger, I am here to tell you that there's a lot of nasty going on at the royal palace. And no, I'm not talking about the current times, although there's already so much to talk about with the current times. We're gonna take a walk together throughout history and see who was supposed to be leading the entire nation. We're also doing on the side. So stick around and let's welcome our top 10 disgusting acts performed by European kings. Number 10. King James I. Hygiene is very important these days, as it is a key factor in reducing the spread of disease, viral infections, and diseases. But for King James I, he was very picky on what should be cleaned first, to the point where he'd only just clean the tip of his fingers. According to Sir Anthony Weldon, who was a courtier of King James I, he noted that the king never bathed, and he wished truthfully he did. According to records, Weldon noted that the king's tongue was too large for his mouth, and whenever King James I would drink any liquids, it would just fall down to the side of his chin, and he wouldn't even bother to wipe his mouth, let alone wash his hands. The courtier noted although he would clean the tips of his fingers, he would only rub the ends just slightly with a wet end of a napkin. Apparently this was the only hygienic thing the king did. Number 9. King Charles VI. When we wake up in the morning and get through the day, we typically have a routine, getting up and showering and brushing our teeth, changing our clothes, etc, etc. But for King Charles VI, he would not change his clothes at all. Like, at all. The king suffered a lot through mental illness, which of course in the years of the 1368 to 1422, that wasn't even a topic to think about, which would be then dub him as the Mad King. King Charles VI would break into fits and tantrums and run wild through his home. Some days there were reported incidents where he was convinced he was made out of glass and he would move. The worst report was an incident that lasted 5 months, where he didn't change his clothes or bathe once. Nearly half a year the king would stay very still and carefully tried to avoid bumping into anyone. Number 8. King Louis XIV. As we already mentioned, it seemed that hygiene happens to be a very aggressive topic in this video, and I'm sorry, I promise it's going to end soon. We're almost there, but if you think about it, it's only because a lot of the times hygienics didn't seem much of a priority, let alone something to even think about for some of these eras. It could relate to mental illness, or maybe it was just so normalized environmentally no one thought of it much. But it's no doubt that in history, when it comes to the 1700s in France, the Palace of Versailles was one of the nastiest, smelliest royal palaces. Noted that the royals would go to the bathroom in the corners of the halls and smell horribly. It seemed very apparent that even their king, King Louis XIV, was also one of the most smelliest of royals. He would use his throne, the very throne many royals themselves would sit in, as a toilet as well. He would even use it while conducting court sessions, and one would expect the court to notice the smell, but when Louis XIV was in the room, the stench of so many other people would overwhelm for anyone to even notice. The king only bathed 3 times in his entire lifespan, which was already on the low side by the 17th century standard. The king would try to make it up by smelling like perfumes, as he would be filling the rooms with flowers and dousing himself in perfume. He actually had a specific team designated to creating new perfumes every week. He would also change his clothes 3 times a day, which he truly believed was the only thing that needed to be clean. And like his toilet habits being shown in court, he would also change his clothes in front of everybody. Yes, he would change his clothes in front of hundreds of men and did so on purpose. Number 7. King Frederick. We all have our favorite snacks, desserts, or meals, and when we were kids, we were always taught of the 4 main food groups, as well as the amount one should consume. Basically the concept of portion control. When you eat healthy, you reduce other health risks like heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and more. But for King Frederick, he had the habit of eating a dessert called semla, which was a sweet roll filled with cream, which to be honest sounds pretty delicious. However, the consumption of so many semla is what killed him. On a typical dinner day, the king would have his meal of lobster, caviar, and many other types of decadent foods that you can think of. But once the meal was done, then came semla. He would consume over 14 semlas in a single setting. As this being a normal routine for him, in 1771 when he would consume the amount of that he usually typically eats, he tried to get up and his stomach unsurprisingly became irritated and he died shortly after. In other words, the king ate himself to death. Number 6. King Frederick Wilhelm. Typically as a 5'3" individual, I'm considered relatively average or short, depending on where I am. But for King Frederick Wilhelm of the German state of Prussia, I'm definitely not his type. See, this king had a thing for tall people, specifically tall soldiers. He was considered an unusual man with particular hobbies. It may not seem bad at first, but he would arrange his soldiers and would pay them based on how tall they were, the tallest being paid the most, and it is considered pretty unfair, but then it gets more bizarre and concerning when he frequently arranged for unusually tall men to be kidnapped. Yeah, he would have tall men kidnapped and press ganged into the unit, and diplomats from other countries would send him tall men as offerings. He became so obsessed to the point where whenever he was sad, he would arrange tall men to just parade in front of him, even in his own bedroom and when he was sick. He had a dream and a goal of having more tall men that he would pair them with tall women so that they could breed new soldiers and possibly more tall men. Sometimes he would even send men to a stretching rack to enhance their height. I know it's a bad joke to say, but I think he'd like that song SZA did about being a big boy. It may not be cuffing season yet, but I'm pretty sure it's always cuffing season for the king. Number 5. Caligula. We all heard of the Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, also known as Caligula, one of the great Roman emperors emperors, but also one of the most vicious and dangerous. Caligula was known as the Mad Roman Emperor, as he tormented and tortured so many in his lifetime. From torturing senators, fellow soldiers, and more, his type of rule was considered so egregious that his reckless behavior as a ruler was one of the many factors Rome would fall. After all, Cornel West did once say, "You can't save the people if you don't serve the people, and you can't lead the people if you don't love the people." But with that being said, Caligula, as many examples of royals who prioritized the wrong things, was more obsessed with his horse, to the point where he appointed his horse to the high office of consul. I don't know what kind of meeting that would be with a horse at the table, but I am curious. Regardless, he was assassinated before he could do so. Number 4. Ferdinand I of Naples. Now, we all love a good trophy for our achievements. It means we did something we should be proud of, and for Ferdinand, he did just that. He had the tendency to be a little bit too prideful, like maybe concerningly. You see, this king had zero compassions when it comes to battles and his enemies. He was sadistic, and although he had political sense and was brave, the king of Naples was truly brutal and inept. Once he dealt with his enemies after tricking them and promising them false amnesty, he had them murdered instead. After the deed was done, he would have them mummified and added to his museums of mummies in their clothes. If he felt he was developing any more enemies, he would invite them over and give them a house tour. That way it was a morbid and effective way to show them, you don't want to mess with me. Number 3. King Henry VIII. Imagine you were a servant at the royal palace and suddenly you were told you got promoted to work for the king directly. I'd like to say you'd be pretty excited. But they didn't really explain in detail what they meant. They said directly. They meant really closely, like his personal butt wiper. The groom of stool was a position in the royal household in the charge of cleaning. You guessed it, the king's backside. Specifically, King Henry VIII. Among many of his reforms, King Henry VIII introduced this job as he plucked out one of the sons of the noble families to literally wipe his, However, those graced with this position would also be required to watch his diet, document them, and then be ready once those bowel movements were cha-chaing their way down. They didn't have baby wipes or baby powder, but they did have to make sure that it was clean and dry. They also had to wipe down his buttocks with a sponge or a wet nurse just to be a glorified butt washer. They were also responsible for helping him urinate and defecate by providing a wash basin or for them to just get a regular old pot. And considering how unhygienic the medieval times were, I don't think they had latex gloves to protect themselves. This job was actually considered a pretty respectable job, as this was a direct intimate access to the king. He would live in the castle and earn a great salary. This tradition King Henry VIII created would then be an ongoing career for the next 400 years. To be fair, this job is equivalent to many medical positions we do now, and at least he should be paid well. Number 2. Tsar of Russia. The Tsar Peter I of Russia, he was a very particular man, especially when it came to people's faces. Although the Tsar was credited with ensuring the reforms in Russia and one of the leading powers growing in Europe, he was also very inconsiderate, even to his friends. Rumor has it when he was invited to a diarist John Evelyn's home, he wrote that he made it his court and palace and then trashed the place, aiming pistols at portraits and destroying the gardens. Among his reforms, he also implemented a beard tax, which means he would line up members of his staff and the entire Russian army and shave their face one by one. He did so because he demanded that the entire country follow suit, as there was a law that countered the Russian Orthodox Church belief that a bare face was blasphemous. King Charles II. Majority would love the idea to live forever or be immune to illnesses, but for King Charles II, he had it arranged to have the mummies in Egypt taken back to be made into medicine and eat them. Yes, people, the European royals ate the royal mummies of Egypt. Considering the early 1900s, mummy mania was the dichotomy of fascination for many, many years, from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, and considering the era, ancient Egyptians were considered one of the most advanced civilizations around the world. So with that being said, the idea of seeing these eternal mummies, Europeans would prescribe ancient mummies as a medicine. Ground the skeletons of their remains would be used as to treat illnesses, headaches, or even the plague. And so with the king consuming the mummies, it was left the impression that the royal and the social elite, it seemed appropriate to eat other royals. But it wasn't just King Charles II either, by the way. Apparently a lot of royals did this too, like William II of England, Francois I of France, and Christian IV of Denmark. All cannibals when it came to medicine. Well, there you have it, our top 10 disgusting acts performed by European kings. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. My name is Jessa, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.